All right, thank you for tuning in to the next in our Research Basics series, this one focusing on institutional review boards and primarily the basics of a human subject's IRB. So we're going to start off talking about what an IRB is and why you might care about what an IRB does. So we're going to talk about the mission and the goal of the IRB and the approach that it takes. We're going to talk a little bit about levels of IRB review, including what types of studies require it. We're going to talk about the criteria for approval. We're going to talk a little bit about consent and HIPAA authorization. And then we're going to talk about some submission tips from the IRB chair that just so happens to be me. So at its heart, the Institutional Review Board that focuses on human subjects research at the university and at Stanford is an ethics committee. So what this means is we formally review, approve, and monitor human subjects research to ensure the safety, rights, and welfare of subjects are protected. We are also tasked with determining the degree and the likelihood of risk associated with a study. And what we're essentially trying to decide is if a study is minimal risk or no more than minimal risk, or if it's greater than minimal risk, and where in that spectrum it lies. So on one side, we have minimal risk, which is the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated are not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. So that's basically saying the least amount of risk that can be present in a study is the risk that you encounter in daily life. That's going to be our starting point. And everything that you do, we're going to see if it elevates that risk. Now, it's not to say that you have to have no more than minimal risk studies. You are allowed to do pretty risky things and have that research approved. But what you have to do is balance the risk from the knowledge gained. And I'll talk more about that as we go through, but that's essentially the goal of the IRB. We're looking to make sure that risks are minimized and everything that's being done is in accordance with federal guidelines. What that means is we are here to protect humans and their rights and their safety, but we are not looking at animal studies, and we are not looking at studies that are involving biological agents. So by that, I mean IACUCs are there for the protection of animals and animal welfare. And then IBC committees are the ones that are looking at biological agents. Now, a study that goes through the IBC, the committee that's looking at biological agents and biological safety, may also have to go through the IRB. So it may need both of those, but our focus is on the protection of the research participants, and IBC is concerned with potential of exposure to hazardous materials, whether that be for the research participants, whether that be the lab individuals themselves, maybe it's both, but their purview is a little bit different. So we're focusing on the rights and welfare of human research participants. So why should you care about this? Well, what the IRB is going to do is ensure that the potential harm to research participants is reduced. Again, it doesn't mean that it's not there. It means that we are reducing it as much as possible. We are doing everything that we can to have participants' rights and safety protected. It doesn't mean that that's always going to be the case. There are some studies that can be approved that are inherently more than minimal risk. Some of them can be quite risky. They can put the participant in quite a bit of risk scenarios. That's okay. But we are there to determine what that risk is and to minimize it wherever possible. It is required for all research involving human subjects participants to go through and be approved by the IRB. This is because first, all federally funded research has to be approved by an IRB if it's using human subjects for them to give you the money. So in order to conduct federally funded or externally funded research, it has to be approved by an IRB. Even if you're funding a research study from your own pocket, You're not using either university funds or federal funds. You are going down to the bank and taking out the money to do the study yourself. It still has to be approved. And the reason for that is most institutions, including the University of South Dakota and Stanford Research, have decided to abide by those CFR regulations. So they have decided that even if you want to do this research out of pocket, it has to be approved by the IRB. And that's just the way that it is. Obviously, there's good reasons for that. You know, human subjects research has a bit of a shady past, and you can spend hours and hours going down the Wikipedia rabbit hole looking at all of the horrible things that have happened in the past in the name of advancing science utilizing human subjects research. So the Milgram experiment and conformity, Stanford prison study, a lot of the medical research of the 40s and 50s and 60s, a lot of genetics research, a lot of research in special populations utilizing prisoners and Native American populations, all did things that today would never be approved by an institutional review board. So it's really an important process to ensure that the research that you're doing is ethical and is not going to get anyone in trouble, and research that you can feel good about at the end of the day, and you can, sleep without having to worry, should I have really done that? The IRB is there to help you ensure that what you're doing is ethical and as safe as possible. The FDA also requires IRB review for research involving a drug, a biological device, or a medical device, and they also ask IRBs to review those studies. So really, anything that is involving human subjects and is classified as research on campus or at Stanford or most institutions require IRB review. So who is the IRB? So at least 5 members. Federal guidelines say you have to have at least 1 scientist, 1 non-scientist, 1 unaffiliated member, so someone who's not affiliated with the university or the research institute, 1 participant advocate, so this is someone to represent the interests of the research participant, and then diversity to represent the type of research being done. So if you look at this, what it's saying is you need someone that understands science, someone that isn't all about science, someone that has no vested interest in what the university or the research institution does, and then 1 person that has a unique knowledge of the study population. So if you're doing a study that's looking at prisoners, for example, you're allowed to do research with individuals that are incarcerated, but the IRB has to make sure that we have someone on the board who can look at that from the perspective of an incarcerated individual and say, yes, this is research that is ethically sound. So they have a unique perspective. So this could perhaps be a prison guard. It could be a former inmate. These individuals have that perspective that they can say, oh, these are the things that you should think about when doing this type of research that other individuals may not. At this point, I'll mention all of the figures that pictures that I'm using in this lecture were all generated by AI. I thought it'd be kind of fun to do. And this is what you get when you have your AI image generator create you a picture of a board that has a scientist, non-scientist, unaffiliated member, and a patient advocate or participant advocate. And it does a pretty good job. It's interesting. So all of the pictures here are generated through AI. The USD IRB goes beyond what's required for these boards. So again, you need a minimum of 5 that cover these bases. We actually have 20 members on our IRB. So 8 of them are full-fledged voting members. 1 of them is a non-scientist, and then we have 7 that are counted as scientists. And then we have 12 alternate members. And these alternate members, 6 of which are non-scientists, are individuals that can take the place depending on which expertise we need. So if our typical standing members of the board don't have expertise or don't reflect a specific participant population, or don't have the background required to review or study, we have 12 alternate members that can come in and can provide review expertise in those circumstances. They're also there in case a regular member isn't available. So if you only had 5 members, if any one of those members weren't able to make it, you wouldn't have enough individuals to review studies, and you wouldn't be able to get anything done that month. So by having multiple members, multiple areas of expertise, and a lot of times overlapping expertise, we can ensure that the IRB remains productive regardless of what who we have show up that day. So who regulates the IRB? Who tells us that this is what we need and how we do things? Biomedical institutional review boards are regulated by 2 groups. First, the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Human Research Protection, so DHHS's OHRP. OHRP, and that is codified in 45 CFR 46 with subparts focusing on special populations. So B, C, and D for pregnant women, fetuses and neonates, and prisoners and children. So whenever you have additional guidelines that you need to follow, there are the subparts to 45 CFR 46, which outline how that has to be done. So in addition to DHHS, there's also the FDA. They have their own federal regulations, 21 CFR 50, 21 CFR 56, that outline how studies that are involving experimental drugs or new devices have to be reviewed by an IRB. So those codified rules tell us what we have to do and how we have to do it. Now, these are, again, sort of the bare minimum. This is what the federal government requires. University of South Dakota and Stanford have gone above and beyond that. We both maintain accreditation from a group known as the Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs, or AHRP. So these are a group of universities that have been accredited by another agency, this AHRP agency, after you've demonstrated that you provide safeguards that meet or surpass the threshold of state and federal requirements, depending on what those requirements are. So we can do the bare minimum and just be a federally approved institutional review board, and we can review federal studies and studies that are seeking federal dollars and things like that. But the University of South Dakota and Stanford have gone above and beyond that and have become members of AHRP. And USD has maintained this status since 2005. So for almost 20 years, we've been going above and beyond what's required of an IRB. We're being held at higher standards to ensure what we're doing is ethical and we're best protecting the rights and welfares of our research participants. So what is research? That's the first question that we have to ask to determine whether you even have to interact with the IRB. And I would direct you to the previous video that I did that I think just had this title, what is research? And it'll go into a whole lot of detail about different types of research. But if we don't want to do that, again, simple codified definition is a systematic investigation including research, development, testing, and evaluation that's designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. If you are doing that, you are engaging in research, and it's something that the IRB may have to approve, as we'll see. The picture here is what our AI picture generator thinks research is in the style of DALL-E. So if you say, make me a picture of research in the style of Salvador Dali, this is what it comes up with. All right, so we've talked about what research is. What is human subjects research? Well, human subjects are also defined in those 45 CFR codified rules. And human subjects are defined as living individuals about whom an investigator conducting research obtains data through intervention or interaction with the individual and has identifiable private information. That's what a human research subject is. So if you're doing research and you're doing these things, it's now human subjects research. So there is a very elegant, if not confusing, set of flowcharts that you can follow to determine whether what you're doing counts as human subjects research. So if we follow this here, just looking at the first chart, as to whether this is research involving human subjects covered by 45 CFR, Part 46. The first thing that it asks is this a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge? And what that's asking is this research? If you say no, then the activity is not research, so 45 CFR Part 46 does not apply, and we can end it there. Now, that's not to say that other federal, state, and local laws or regulations may apply. This is just telling you that according to 45 CFR Part 46, this is not research. So if we answered yes to that, then the question is going to focus on whether this is counting as human subjects research. So we've established its research. Is it involving human subjects? So it asks questions like, does the research involve intervention or interaction with the individual? Remember, that was part of our definition. Are you interacting with someone who's identifiable? Are you providing an intervention? So it'll go through those questions, and you can follow it, and it'll tell you whether this is human subjects research or not. If this is daunting, and in a lot of cases it can be, you can certainly contact any member of the IRB. You can send me an email. You can send the director of the IRB an email. You can give us a call, whatever the case may be. We have a blanket humansubjects@usd.edu email address that you can send questions to. We can help walk you through whether your research would count as human subjects research. Now, once you've determined a project is human subjects research, that doesn't mean that it's going to have to go full board IRB review. There are classes of research that are known as exempt, and there is another flowchart that can help you identify whether your research is exempt or not. So there are certain classes, and using this chart, and we're starting off. We've already answered from chart 1 that this is human subjects research. Now we want to see, does it fall into any of these categories that are exempt? And I'll talk more about these in a few slides, but there are a few conditions where even if you're doing human subjects research, it doesn't have to be reviewed by the IRB because it's in these exempt categories. Again, if you have questions about whether your research is exempt or not, certainly talk to us. We can help you make that determination. So what is the IRB doing? What is it that we are looking for when we're looking at studies? And there's a number of things that we're focusing on. We're certainly looking at the protection of participant safety and well-being. But we're also looking at the scientific validity of the research project, the qualifications of the investigation team, and whether you're adhering to federal regulations in USD or Sanford policies. So the last two bullet points there, adherence with federal regulations and policies, those are definitely things that people recognize, yes, the IRB should be reviewing. Where we get a lot of questions and oftentimes a lot of lively discussions with investigators is when we're looking at the scientific validity of the research project and the qualifications of the investigator and the research team. A lot of times, investigators are going into it thinking this has nothing to do with IRB review. Your job is to determine whether the research is ethical and whether it is safe. And if you make that determination, it doesn't matter if the science is good or not. And what we try and stress to those individuals, and what I'll try and stress to you now, is it is absolutely the role of the human subjects IRB to make this determination, to evaluate the validity of the scientific questions being addressed in that protocol. And the reason for that is we have to say, to approve a study, that the knowledge that we gain from it is enough to offset, to outweigh the relative risk. Even if you have a no more than minimal risk study, you have to get something out of it in order to justify it. If the research is lousy, if there is no scientific validity to the work that's being done, no amount of risk is tolerable, because we don't get anything out of it. So the scales are heavily weighted to, we cannot approve this because there's absolutely no scientific knowledge being gained. In contrast, we may approve a study that has a lot of risk associated with it. So it is more than minimal risk. Participants are being exposed to conditions that may actually put them in harm's way. as long as those risks are being minimized as much as possible and the information that we gain from it outweighs those relative risks, we can approve it. So we do have to look at the scientific validity of the study and say, okay, although this is a study that probably no one's ever going to get any sort of harm from it, since we can't get any information about it, there's no scientific utility, we don't approve it. And that's what we have to do. Similarly, you can have a wonderful study, beautifully proposed. If we don't think that you are the team that can do that research, we can't approve it. Because a big question is not only, well, what is the study looking at, but is the team in a position to actually complete it? If we don't think that you can complete that research, again, the scientific value of that research is 0. If the scientific value is 0, we can't approve it. So we have to, again, weigh the benefits to the potential risks of harm to the research participants. So those, like I said, we have a lot of discussions at times with investigators because no one wants to hear that your research doesn't have scientific validity, or we question the scientific validity. Sometimes they're able to change the protocol or explain a little bit better, go beyond what was in the protocol and explain to us what the scientific validity of the research is. And in those cases, then we can approve it. But we cannot approve research that we don't think has any scientific validity to it. One of the reasons why it's really important that our IRB members have a broad range of expertise, because we have to be able to make those assessments. So what else are we looking at? So again, risks to the subjects have to be minimized. The risks are reasonable in relation to the benefits. So this is what I was just talking about. If you have 0 benefits, no amount of risk is reasonable, so we won't approve it. Equitable subject selection. So is the process by which you are selecting research participants equitable? So there has been a history, again, in human subjects research of doing things in non-equitable ways. Certain populations may benefit from a research study that doesn't benefit other populations. We want to minimize that. We want to make sure that the ability to participate in research is equitable. We want to make sure that there's adequate protection for privacy and confidentiality. So not everyone wants people to know that they're in a research study. We want to make sure that that information is kept as private and as confidential as possible. So the only way people find out that you were in a research study was if you want them to. There's, of course, additional safeguards for vulnerable subjects, and I'll talk a little bit about this, but in its simplest form, if you're working with special protected populations, these populations are usually protected at this higher level because of things that were done in the past that perhaps shouldn't have been. Studies that focus on pregnant women, or with incarcerated individuals, Native American populations. These may have additional safeguards for special populations. Some of these are codified. So prisoners, again, are a codified group. So if you are doing work with prisoners, you have to do extra things to have that protocol approved. Other groups, like Native American individuals, that may not be codified, but we are still looking at ensuring that safeguards are in place to ensure that this study is taking into account the special population here. So for example, with the University of South Dakota's IRB, we have a member that can speak to Native American concerns because they are a Native American member that has that background and that experience and has lived that life to be able to say, hey, these are the things that are of concern that we may not know otherwise. We want to make sure that consent will be sought or documented, or a waiver of consent is in place if that's a possibility. So these are the things that we're looking at for approval in these studies. So what types of review are there? There are reviews of not human subjects research, which you can imagine are pretty quick. There are exempt, expedited, and full board. So if you look at this as a pyramid, with the top of the pyramid being the least amount of effort, non-human subjects research does not require review. And then we move into exempt or limited reviews. These are studies that are in exempt categories according to the DHHS that allow you to have them either exempt or just undergo limited review. Then we have expedited reviews, which again are also codified by DHHS that says for these types of studies, they can be reviewed in an expedited manner. So they don't have to go to the full board. Full board reviews everything that does not fall under an exempt or an expedited category. If we can't cycle or funnel it into an expedited or exempt category, it has to go full board. And there are some disadvantages of a study going full board that I'll talk about in a few moments. But as far as exempt projects go, these are studies that are done as part of normal classroom procedures which don't collect identifying information. They can be surveys or questionnaires of adults in which you don't ask sensitive questions or get identifying information, or it can be retrospective research in which data already exists and you don't have any identifying information. If you have an exempt project that meets one of these scenarios, you should still submit it to the IRB to allow us to make that determination. The investigator should not be the one to decide a project is exempt. So you can decide a project is not human subjects research. If you go through that flowchart and you decide, oh, no, this doesn't count as human subjects research. But if you're looking at whether it's exempt or not, if it's human subjects research, you should submit it to the IRB and allow us to make that categorization. If you're not sure if your research counts as human subjects research, then again, submit it to the IRB and we can help you through that process and make that determination. If you have any doubts at all, it's easiest to go through the IRB. We can make those decisions quite quickly and get you on your way. So those are exempt projects. These ones don't have to be reviewed. Expedited studies can be reviewed, but to a lesser extent. This doesn't mean, when I say lesser extent, that we're not concerned about it. What I mean is that it goes to one or two experienced IRB reviewers. It doesn't go to the full board. So we have a study comes in, if it can meet one of these expedited categories, we can say, oh, well, I'll just send this one to Lee. He's an expert in this. He can give it a look over. And if he thinks that it's okay, we don't have to take it to the full board. These are always going to be minimal risk studies. So that means that it can't be investigational drugs or devices, can't be a protected population, can't be looking at very sick people or highly sensitive procedures being involved. Any of those things immediately would elevate the risk to more than minimal risk, and therefore it wouldn't be expedited, it would go full board. So again, as a reminder, minimal risk is the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research, not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life of the general population or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. So if you're doing anything that elevates someone's risk from what they would normally encounter, it's now no more than minimal, and it's not going to be expedited. A more than minimal risk study will always go full board. Some no more than minimal risk studies will also go full board. So there might be ones that we want the entire expertise of the IRB to look at, or there might be ones that we're not sure at what the level of risk is. We may have that go full board to help make that determination. And in fact, that's usually our class of full board review studies are ones that aren't more than minimal risk, but we want to take advantage of the expertise of the entire board. A full board study has to meet IRB deadlines because the full board only meets once a month. So if you go online and look at our website, there will be deadlines for getting materials in. If you do not get your materials in by those deadlines, your project will not be able to be reviewed that month, and it'll be put on the docket for the next month. So already you have a whole month delay in getting your research approved. So work within those deadlines to make sure that your project is getting reviewed. Typically, research that is greater than minimal risk will go in there, one using vulnerable populations, one that has unapproved drugs or devices, surveys with sensitive questions. These are all going to go full board. And again, those studies that we want the expertise of the full board to look at, because this is the only chance that we have to have a study go to the full board. In these circumstances, 2 or more reviewers are assigned to read it. Once they're assigned to read it, they may be going through and immediately have questions for you or feedback. changes to incorporate before the review occurs at the level of the board. If you get an email like that, I highly suggest you respond to those comments as quickly as possible. What we're trying to do there is, as we're going through and reviewing it, if I'm a reviewer that's been assigned this more than minimal risk study that's going to go full board, there are small little things that I may pick out that I know has to change for it to get approved. There's no sense in us waiting for the full board review to bring up those changes and then ask you to make them. So instead, I will send you an email and say, hey, if you change these things, that'll alleviate some of the concerns that the board's going to have. And then you can make those changes, you can resubmit before the board meets with those changes in, and then there's fewer things that we have to look at. So it's a way to speed up that review process, because again, the full board only meets once every month. And if you don't have it approved, you're gonna have to, in often cases, wait until the next month to have that study approved. So during the meeting, once you've addressed those little things, the primary and secondary reviewer are going to present the study, talk about it, along with their recommendations, the things that they noticed that they think need to be changed that weren't addressed in that pre-review stage, and then we will make those recommendations. That information ultimately will make it back to the investigators. Now, the other thing that I would recommend, in addition to making sure that you meet deadlines and respond to feedback quickly, is to be available during the meeting or have someone on your study team available. Oftentimes what can happen is, as we're discussing the protocol, we may have a question that you could answer like that very, very quickly, but we can't answer it for you. So if you are in the building, outside of the room, but in the building, and we know that you're there, we can ask you to come in and ask you questions. If you provide a phone number or want to Zoom, we can set that up so we can bring you into the meeting and ask you those questions straight away. So again, this is tackling things so it doesn't have to go back to you and then potentially go through a full month until it gets back to the IRB to review, because the whole board member is there, all of the board members are there, and we can ask our questions, and if you can answer them and alleviate our concerns, we can approve it on the spot rather than having to get you the feedback, allow you to incorporate it, and then potentially have it take a whole nother month before it comes back to the board to review. Now, there are some types of modifications that don't have to go back to the full board. If they are things that we can tell you, do this, do this, do this, and then someone in the office, the IRB office, checks to make sure that you did those things, we can approve it without having it come back to the full board. So we can recommend withholding approval pending minor modifications back to the level of the office. So the office looks to see if these things were done, back to the level of the reviewers. So the initial reviewers look at it and decide whether it was accomplished, or back to the level of the full board. And that means it's going to take another month because we won't look at it again until that next meeting. If they are more than minor modifications, if they are things that we can't tell you to do, that we have questions about, we cannot recommend it go back to the level of the office or to the reviewers. For major changes, it has to come back to the full board. It's one of the reasons why it's great to be available, and it's great to get a lot of those questions out of the way ahead of time. So our goal is to make sure that you get your protocol approved as quickly as possible, and we would love that if it's the first review. That makes less work for everyone. So a little bit about consent and HIPAA authorizations. I don't have enough time to go into a whole lot of detail about this stuff, but it's just important to be aware that you will have to do things like an informed consent form. If you are administering a clinical or behavioral intervention, we want to make sure that people are given enough information, that's the informed part, to consent to participate. And there are guidelines and requirements of informed consent forms. There are templates on the USD website that you can look at, but it's important to make sure that you're following those guidelines. Similarly, if you want access to a patient's health records, you may have to get a HIPAA addendum, so a waiver that the participant signs that says, yes, I am allowing my health provider to give you access to my medical records, and then we're able to do that. So there are these types of authorizations that can be required. There are alterations or waivers of these things that can happen as well. Again, beyond the scope of this discussion, but it's good to know that, in some cases, it's not practicable to complete a research project if you are getting informed consent from everyone. And if that's the case, you may be able to get a waiver. If it's no more than minimal risk, you may not have to get people to provide their informed consent. Now, that's a really sort of difficult thing to demonstrate. So you can't say it's difficult for me to do the research if I don't get informed consent, so I won't. Or I'd have to ask so many people, so I want a waiver. This is by asking someone's consent to participate in the research, it would ruin the research. That's when we provide these types of waivers. And again, it has to be no more than minimal risk. So what I'd like to talk about next is just a little bit of background on what I like to think of as the infallible IRB. So what you should be getting from this talk is we are firstly all very nice to work with, and we do all that we can to get your research approved. We're looking out for your best interests. We're looking out for our human subject participants' best interests. Safety is of the utmost concern. These are the things that we're looking at, but we really are an asset to help with your research project. We're not something to get in the way of doing research. We are something there to make sure that the research that's being done is of the best ethical nature that it can be. Now, what do I mean when I say the infallible IRB? What I mean by that is, even though we're here to be an asset and to make sure that you get your research approved, if for some reason we do not approve the research, we are the final word. So there is no appeals process. You can certainly ask us to reconsider, and we'd love to chat about it. And if you'd say, these are the reasons why I think that this research should be approved, or the decision that you made is wrong, we'll reconsider it. But if we decide that no, this research is not approvable, there's no one higher up to go to. So you can't go to your dean and say, oh, the IRB is giving me a real hard time. Can you help me get this research through? You can't go to the president of the university and say, oh, President Gestring, I'm having a hard time getting this research through. Can you do anything to help? We are the ultimate authority. Our power comes down from the federal government. They are telling us that we have the power to approve and unapprove or disapprove studies, and that's it. So that's what I mean by saying that we're infallible. Now, in the 8 or 9 years that I've been chair of our IRB, we've never had to do this. But if it comes down to it, it's important for investigators to know that there's no appeal process above us. If the IRB does not approve your research, it just cannot be done. And that is the end of it. Sanford works the same way. So in both of those instances, all of the power to approve studies go to the IRB, and we are independent of university administration or Sanford Research or Sanford Health's administration. They cannot overrule what the IRB says, and they cannot influence the IRB to go a certain way. All right. So again, like I said, we've never had to do that, but I just like to point that out so people know that it's important to respond to the suggestions that we have. All right, why should I care? Well, obviously failure to follow DHHS and FDA regulations is not a great thing. There are penalties for individual researchers, there's penalties for institutions. And just last month, there was an example where a single research project ultimately resulted in all research at the New York State Psychiatric Institute at Columbia University being shut down. So you can read the article. It's actually a really interesting read, but there were individuals that were participating in a study, and one of those study participants died. And in investigating that death, it was determined that probably some bad stuff happened. The article doesn't say what those things are, but there were probably guidelines and protocols that were not followed. When that was discovered, the Human Subjects IRB of the Institute shut down research and let the federal government know, hey, look, we came across this situation. These are the things that we found wrong. We've shut down research. And the federal government came back and said, yep, that's some bad stuff. The university can no longer perform research. So not just that investigator team, not just that individual, all federally funded research at this institute was halted. No one could do it anymore. And it will remain halted until the DHHS, Office of Human Subjects Protection, comes in and says, all right, now you're doing things properly, now research can resume. So these are big, big ramifications, right? You would not want to be responsible for your entire institution's research for being shut down. Now, again, the details in this specific case are still pretty not well identified, but I can imagine there's, again, some pretty drastic things that were happening there that really shouldn't have been, that were against regulations. And the investigator that was leading the study is no longer there. So whether they were fired or whether they quit or whatever the case may be, they are no longer a researcher. So, again, big time penalties associated with doing these things. So you should definitely follow IRB protocol guidelines for those reasons. But of course, we're all ethical individuals as well. We don't want to be responsible for doing something wrong. Regardless of the implications for our career, we want to do things ethically and make sure that we're protecting people as best we can. And the IRB is a tool to help you be able to do that. All right, just a couple more slides about some best practices and submission tips. So first, definitely review the submission guidance on our website and ask questions of the IRB staff. We love talking about this sort of stuff. We can answer questions. We can help you craft your proposals. We can do all of that and are happy to do so. Second, use simple language in consent forms and in your application. So this is not the time to come off sounding really smart. We know that you're all very smart people. What we want to do is make sure that you're explaining in a way that is understandable to a lay audience, especially when it comes to the consent form. So your consent form has to be written in a language that is understandable by your participant population. What we are typically looking for is a writing at a grade 8 level. If you write at a grade 8 level, for an adult population, chances are everyone's going to be able to understand what you are saying. If you're using fancy words and long, subordinate clause sentences and things, it's going to be difficult for someone without a high level of education to understand that consent form. And again, the informed part of that title, informed consent, means that they understand things. And if you're writing at a level that they can't understand, it will not be approved. Microsoft Word has a feature where you can actually check the reading level. And like I said, we try and get things down to a grade 8 level. That can be really tough. When you're working with children, working on their informed assent document. So someone under the age of 18, according to these guidelines, can't perform consent, but they may be able to perform assent. So under the age of consent, now they are going to actually go through and get their permission to do it. There, the reading language has to be even less. Utilize our template protocols and consent forms, and make sure everyone has taken their city training. So you've learned a little bit about city training. You have to make sure that that stuff gets done. Provide rationale so we understand why you're doing the research. Again, we have to understand the scientific validity. And then, of course, tell us what you want to do in plain and simple language so we can understand it. Give yourself plenty of time so we make sure that we're able to go through that review process. And then if you're dealing with complex or greater than minimal risk research, here, work with the IRB more. Make sure that you're doing everything that you can to make sure that it gets reviewed at that board meeting, and a lot of the questions ahead of time are able to be done. Use our protocols. We've decided that this is a great way to convey that information. So when you use that, it is better for everyone. If you're administering a drug, device, product, the study can only be reviewed at the expedited level if these two conditions are provided, qualifies for an exemption, and the protocol is minimal risk. So that is it. If you have any questions about any of this, you can certainly contact me, contact the IRB. We would love to chat about this. I think I have at least another one of these recordings to do, so I will be talking to you all fairly soon.